As Gidon Talmor said just a few moments ago, or perhaps an hour ago, as it was said at the Commission, we would be delighted to hear Shaul Zemach, who was not only the Director General of the Ministry of Energy, but also the chairman of that same committee that we're all acquainted with. And usually at that point, the role ends. But I would like to take advantage of the fact that he already has a microphone to ask a question. I don't mean to sort of trick him and trip him up, but if the committee that had been headed by you would know what they would have known what they know now about our energy market and the fluctuations in the price that we unfortunately haven't seen the end of them. We might see even declines and increases, in my opinion, perhaps not to $110, but we could still see certain hikes, maybe to 100 or a little less. Would you have reached at that point the same conclusions, especially vis-a-vis the preservation of the same kind of quantities? Because it's very possible that Israel should sell everything that it has and buy either gas or oil at a cheaper price. After all, the prices will be decreased because it is very close and linked to that kind of thing. Would you, in your opinion, I mean, it's hypothetical, of course, but would you have reached the same conclusions at the time? And thank you. Shalom and good afternoon, one and all. I'd like to perhaps open and relate to a certain point that Amos Yadlin said this morning about the forecast, the regional ones, the sort of statesmanship, the political situation, and the various security sort of circumstances. After all, we're dealing a lot in the economic implications of the prices of oil and everything that is happening in our region. Everything that has been called the Arab Spring or those turbulent changes in the Arab world. But we have to remember, and we discussed it here at the INSS a few weeks ago, that anything connected to the energy market and the provision, the supplying of energy to the Israeli market, 10 North Koreans who are 20 years of age are a bigger threat to the supply, a strategic threat to the supply of energy, even more so than 10,000 trained combatants and militants of the Hezbollah or Hamas on the border. And one has to keep that in mind when you plan things ahead. And you have to be ready, on alert for that kind of threat, and also sort of feel that you have to re-strengthen yourself and recollect yourself after that. Now, if I look, I won't relate so much to the actual world issues, but rather the Israeli energy, and especially the liquefied gas here, and what needs to be done and what should be done in various circumstances in order to reach our objective that should be serving our needs, and that is, of course, ensuring the energy supply to our public. Those are the topics that I'm going to talk about. The first topic was already mentioned by Gidon, but I'll also mention the sort of the various criteria now. Now, one We're talking about an entire regional issue when we talk about it. It's not just Israeli. When you look at the actual Levantine basin, then there are things that sort of go past its borders, beyond the borders of Israel. In order to be able to take advantage of this entire potential of this basin, it's incumbent upon us to find some kind of cooperation and collaboration between all the countries on the issues of demand and our preparedness from the point of view of infrastructure. Of course, there are geopolitical and economic considerations and priorities that need to be taken into account. But I'll go over sort of some things that have already been said today, but just so that if we go and we talk about the various sort of discoveries and the explorations, we're talking about 3,500 BCM. That's the order of magnitude that Israel could possibly take part in here, and we're talking about that's about 40%, and I think that more or less is from the EZ's kind of area as well. And from the Zemach committee's conclusions, which I'll mention in a moment, we also took into account something which was a lot more sort of conservative from the point of view of our evaluation. And I think we could have even perhaps dared a little more and not be so conservative, but that's what we did. I'd like to stress a point that, in my opinion, that is misleading us somewhat. The situation that we find ourselves in today, despite this phenomenon of the gas vis-à-vis the local consumption, from the point of view of the actual surety of provision of the gas is not as good as it was. That certainty of it was not as good as it was a decade ago. Why? Because we made a change that exposed the Israeli economy to a new kind of energy, and that's the natural gas. But this capability to supply it, because of various constraints and restrictions, is weaker, is lower. So therefore, we saw that in 2005, when we only had Mary B, in other words, so much less gas potentially than there is today, but the consumption of the gas was extremely low in the Israeli actual economy. So the actual stopping that provision, that supply, wouldn't have had a terrible detrimental effect. But if we're talking about the actual generation of electricity based on gas at that time, wasn't very high. So I sort of I wrote down those things for myself, and it's because we now have an additional one through LNG, which is absurd, which improves our capability to ensure the provision, in other words, gas from other sources, because all the gas now comes from one source at the moment, which is extremely focused and very problematic, and that's an element that we have to, really incumbent upon us now to improve, and that's the role of the government in the security of that kind of provision. In other words, we shouldn't be taking on our shoulders too great a risk. In other words, I'll say it in other words, we can see a process of a kind of addiction of the market to natural gas without that natural gas being able to be provided in a reliable, sort of sure, certain way. In other words, therefore, we have to be somewhat cautious and wary. Thus, in a schematic way, the gas is divided in this basin and distributed in this basis. Now, we're talking about potential quantities, you can see, at least in Israel's case. And again, I'm somewhat conservative in my opinions, more conservative than the data that Gidon presented, and I really think that we ought to be conservative here. But what we should see here is that the discoveries in Israel have validated the GES's actual predictions, because they say that there is a prediction, a forecast, a potential, but it has to be proven. And if the methodology is the same, then there's no reason why it shouldn't be the same as, for example, in Cyprus, that have already proven themselves, or in the case of Lebanon, that is sharing that same field with us. But we have to remember, in the regional context, this whole issue of natural gas, which is an additional resource, a new one in this neighborhood, goes in two directions. On one hand, it could be a source for stability, from the aspect that every player or neighbor shares that interest to maximize its profits that emanate from that resource. But of course, all the other countries have to make sure that everyone's playing that game and they're all participating. And if that doesn't happen, then we have got an additional factor that could possibly create conflict in this region, in addition to that nice long list for the causes of the conflict that already exist. So there is a potential accumulation of just an additional one, an aggregate, an additional one. And I'm not just talking about the Palestinian conflict, but there could be an even more radical expression, a manifestation of that question on issues, for example, with Cyprus, Turkey, even talking about sending warships that could possibly even threaten and perhaps even clash. An additional dimension of instability that has to be taken into account very seriously, in all earnest. And the State Department are leading an approach, a diplomatic approach, that Amos Orstein is actually responsible for, that believes in the use of this resource in order to stabilize the region. And the reason that he's come with such urgency and is working in the region on this is with an intention of using these discoveries in order to stabilize the region and to prevent any additional conflicts emanating from it all and developing. So now, what's the million-dollar question? How can you turn a potential resource into something proven, into gas, in other words, that could be used in power plants and industrially? So in my opinion, the main issue is that of the infrastructure. What we need to do is to plan the infrastructures, the marine ones most specifically, in order to optimize this potential resource. Now, just pay attention that this is different from the plans that the actual companies, Noble and Delek, and all the other partners are. They're not the owners of the entire basin, only part of it, and they're doing it differently. If they do it differently from what we want, it might actually do it somewhat riskily from what the government wants to do, while they envision the entire region. So they have to be very careful how they do that when they plan out the infrastructure. So this is a regional dimension that has to be taken into account. One needs the infrastructure to be planned in advance, very carefully, in order to minimize the uncertainty that is a derivative of the question of what will happen if. What if they actually start drilling into deeper water and they reach and they find gas? Then what will they do with it? If someone must have said something in the audience, so he said, if they have a way of selling it, in other words, to export it in a way that they won't have a detrimental effect on a competitor. I think it could be a very transparent factor. The government has to be extremely involved, massively so, and desirable also that it should be operated by someone who is not part of the pool of competitors. And I know that you mentioned the Zemach committee. I won't go into the nitty-gritty committee and explain all that, but I'll just sort of speak about one of the conclusions. I think the Zemach committee did refer to the issue of infrastructure and put them on the table, and did say that the government needs to be involved in it very deeply. And vis-à-vis that issue, there's less going on recently, and it is of paramount importance to accelerate the actual treating and dealing with the infrastructure. And in addition to that, because I'm well acquainted with most of the big infrastructure projects in Israel, I am not acquainted with, I mean, even if I look back the last 15 years, I have not seen a project whose actual yield and its ROI is high enough and will actually do the best with that investment in gas. So therefore, you have to build it in such a way that all the priorities come into play. Now, and another question comes to mind when we're talking about export, and of course there's no controversy vis-à-vis that there is enough. There's sufficient quantity that can be exported. We'll talk about that in a moment from the point of view of the quota, but there is enough, yes, and therefore there should be a very clear-cut, unequivocal decision about what would the government like to see as its priorities vis-à-vis the actual export of gas. Priorities from the point of view of geopolitical influence, or ROI financially talking. In other words, that the government should say what its directives are and not let the private sector take steps and then in hindsight come and say, oh, that's not good, that is good. In other words, it should be in advance. It should be stated very unequivocally. In other words, that those actual players in the field in our exclusive economic market, what does the government think are the geopolitical priorities, and in advance to state them. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves once again in the situation of saying, hey, there's a de facto privatization of our foreign ties, because if we do not actually state our directives, they're going to find themselves in some kind of reaction rather than actual balance. So I've actually put this slide here because I didn't know that Gideon would show his slides. I think that the companies are hesitating and vacillating with the same kinds of considerations that the government has. What are the directions of the gas from 2 points of view, 2 aspects? The companies, of course, it's more financial and economic considerations, and the government, geopolitical considerations. But I'd like to add here that sometimes we tend to somewhat be confused about pipes, gas pipes that connect between countries, do not create diplomatic ties or personally good geopolitical ties. On the contrary, when there are good diplomatic ties, you can actually lay a pipeline between 2 countries. It doesn't work that way, and we've seen it, especially in the Middle East, when you link all sorts of pipes over the last 100 years. But when the ties go down the drain, then it doesn't work. So, I mean, you just have a look at that pipe that is sort of conducting oil from the actual drilling rigs in Iraq to Haifa. The axis still exists. Okay, so when we talk about geopolitical considerations, I would like to stress that we are talking about considerations that the government needs to place in its agenda that it is presenting to the companies. What technologies are we talking about? That is, if high-tech companies want to actually talk about them. We talk about the pipe to Turkey, to Cyprus, to Egypt, Greece, Italy. Well, it's obvious that you won't have pipes all over to all these places, so you have to say what your priorities are or preferences are and say it open and put them on the table so that the companies will know how to react to it. Then you've got the local markets, for example, the Palestinian Authority, the Jordanian Kingdom, Turkey. Nice pictures, by the way, that substantiate for you that we're talking about infrastructure facilities that are extremely complex from an engineering and financial point of view, not something that you can decide on in one fell swoop and then, oh, sorry, change my mind. We've decided it has to go all the way. And I'm thinking even in terms, for environmental terms and things like that as well. These are very important considerations and very long-term ones. Now, the economic considerations, the objective, as it is acceptable to understand when the government considerations are spoke about, is you're trying to create value for your local market, highest value. And then you have to think about the local costs and prices and tariffs. At what price should gas be sold in the state of Israel? It's a very problematic issue. The government has to state what it thinks vis-à-vis that issue, or to say it doesn't think anything about it. But the background or the threat that is sort of surrounding us with the intervention of the government is one of those things that doesn't seem to be beneficial. It's something you should do rather than talk about it so much, because when there are threats that hover around everyone, then it actually very negatively impacts people's considerations about investment. Now, alongside that, you have the fiscal issue. In other words, the tax policies, fiscal policies in order to enable investments. Now, what is the profile or the structure of the planning that is most suited for the development of this resource as the government foresees it and envisions it? Otherwise, we're talking about just reactive things rather than actually planning in advance, because otherwise you lose so much time along the way. The entrepreneur plans things because he wants to implement and he wants to bring that yield and his return on the investment as quickly as possible. And then he goes to the government, and then the government says, oh, now I've examined it all, I want to do something different. So why don't they do it in advance? And then local content. In other words, procurement, which is local, job creation, all sorts of other things, inter alia, connected to the actual sort of things that you can draw out of what the government has said. I mean, you can say all sorts of things, a very wide spectrum of things, but it's very important that things should be said in order to create that certainty that is of paramount importance when you're talking about such order of magnitude investments. A national gas company. Now, in this context, I would like to stress a point that people don't seem to emphasize in that big argument about the gas in Israel. The decision was a decision. It was an informed decision, perhaps an even ideological one, nearly ideological, to extricate the government from this whole domain of natural gas. It was an informed decision. There were 3 or 4 government companies who actually were exploring for gas. And at some point they were privatized and sold, and the government said, okay, I'm out because it's too dangerous. And it was an informed decision. It was another model was adopted of various licenses, permits, wherein they were inviting private companies to come in and be sort of involved according to the law in Israel. You can also say that the upstream field was not the only one wherein the government said they don't want to be involved in. Even in the distribution market, they said it's going to be private entrepreneurs, tenders. They divided the country into 5 areas, and that there would be a various percentage of procurers who would bring the gas ultimately and distributors. That was an informed decision. I think the irregular situation was the actual conduction system that was actually established for the sake of that. And I'm telling you that that happened because the actual concessionaires tender that he gave in, he actually failed with his tender. I don't remember when that was, 2005 or whatever. Gideon actually spoke one of the petitions, the Semidan petition to the High Court, wherein that was based on a government suit demand that it should be built. This concessionaire, Semidan, should build it for providing it to the public. But the petition was that there shouldn't be that kind of privilege or right. So then they created the Nutgaz company, etc., etc. But the perception was that the government shouldn't be involved. Of course, you can change that perception if you want, that concept. Just as you can change any concept when things change. You can reconsider and make other decisions. It's sometimes actually even crucial in such swiftly changing world. The government has the right to receive 12.5% of that specific product to its hands, 12.5% of the gas, and to sell it at whatever price they want, whenever, to whoever, however. That possibility exists, and the royalties are paid in money because that was their preference. They could have done it in any other way. And I'm stressing it because that was the policy that was adopted by the government. In other words, they could have chosen it to do it in kind in any other way. And the controversy nowadays is basically sort of storming around other things is somewhat restricted because they keep putting on their agenda two things. One, opposite contradicting each other, and you could have chosen so many more. There should have been a whole gamut of possibilities, and they should have been more creative in that. But here there's a resolution that the government made which is not connected to whether entrepreneurs could afford to actually implement those kind of projects or not. And of course, with the advantages and disadvantages of a government company being involved. But you also have to pay attention that in the world, by the way, that is the path and the model that is chosen when you try and develop a new resource. The cases wherein the market is totally dependent on private companies are, by the way, few and far between. They are actually pretty sort of irregular when you're thinking about the entire market outside. Of course, there is a capability of creating more demand in the Israeli economy, and that is vis-à-vis transport. Someone spoke about the influence, the impact of the prices of oil on the stability of countries. Israel can use its natural gas more in order to decrease its dependence on import. So vis-à-vis this, I would like to say that there's a kind of terminology confusion between the security of supply and self-sufficient supply. It's not the same thing. And in certain cases, it could perhaps bring the same result or outcome, but it's not the same thing. On our agenda, theoretically, we could reach a situation wherein Tamar will supply our entire need for the IEC and electricity needs of the state of Israel so that we'd be self-sufficient. But boy, that is certainly not security of supply. So therefore, one shouldn't confuse the two. The aim should be security of supply and not self-sufficiency. Very different. And because it doesn't need to be self-sufficiency, then there's nothing wrong if you diversify through imports. It ought to be done in an enlightened, informed way and optimize it from the point of view of security of supply. Of course, you could also develop petrochemical industries, that additional ones that lean on natural gas. Because I remember at the time at the Zemach committee, the big argument was the person who was the flag bearer who wanted to create additional petrochemical industries was the Ministry of the Environment, which is pretty extraordinary from the point of view of that ministry. And that will be explored the moment entrepreneurs come and say, we do want to found such and establish such petrochemical industries, and let's see how the government then reacts. I would like here, at this point, perhaps to put a kind of circle that expresses a different priorities, dimensions vis-a-vis the exporting of natural gas. I think already at the Zemach committee, it was said that the neighboring countries, in other words, all those that consume through ground-laying pipes, are at a preference from the point of view of Israel, geopolitically, of course. In other words, to use a resource in an enlightened, sort of informed manner and let other people enjoy it is always something positive from a moral point of view, but it also justifies itself from an economic point of view and also from the point of view of the geopolitical impact of exporting gas to short distances for consumers who are very close by. We can see that in our more remote distance, geographical, Egypt, Turkey, or perhaps even Europe, again, those are more complex geopolitical considerations, and wherein you need to determine what those actual considerations are. And you also have the Asian market, which is perhaps the most profitable one, at least it was, until the market started fluctuating recently. The most profitable, but the most complex, the most complicated to arrive at from the point of view of the infrastructure, LNG facilities, which would be complicated and very difficult, which is very difficult to see how we would finance them. So I would like to conclude perhaps with the question that Oded asked, which is a legitimate question in the context of, would I have changed something in the recommendations of the Zemach committee now retrospectively? I would just like to say somewhat cautiously and somewhat with a smile that the Zemach committee's report, from the point of view of its impact or centrality within the gas market, is a kind of Magna Carta of the natural gas in Israel, and as such it was designated to be a kind of road map. It took all the relevant players, included them in one room, and came out with one outcome, which was coherent. Now, why is it coherent? Because it was agreed upon by all the government ministries and was accepted as a government decision. What made it as such is that it was flexible enough to contain all the government interests embedded within it. And of course, we know that the government has difficulty in playing, let's say, very sort of in sports terms, to participate, collaborate, and to actually play as one team on the pitch. And it's become more and more difficult because there are more and more factors in the government who seem to be doing more of the same thing. And therefore, when you establish additional entities or bodies, you need to coordinate between them so that they'll be able to act. And now that we need to rectify and we need to deal with that. Now, the conclusions of such a committee are never static. They're always dynamic. Those conclusions need to be revisited each time anew in the light of the circumstances. And I think in the circumstances of today, if you look at the dimensions like competitiveness, competition, I mean, the report dealt in those issues as well and gave us sort of some kind of a pseudo kind of solution for those issues of competition. To a certain degree, it could be even relevant if they do want to adopt that model. From the point of view of the export, I do not doubt that the export should be a tool that enables the development of Leviathan, because otherwise we'll find ourselves in enormous controversy. Don't forget, lots of lawyers here will make a lot of money out of that conflict vis-à-vis the development of Leviathan. But the Israeli economy and market will lose. So therefore, you have to take into account that you need to connect as many interests as possible so that you can reach your objective. Where did the things need, yes, to be revisited? I think in the system, the method about new rights with which you are going to embark on your journey with. Because if you, in the situation today, with the prices today, it's very difficult to make decisions about what's going to happen in 20 years' time. But you do need to examine what would be the right system in order to get your best ROI if you start it tomorrow morning. But the greatest importance is in the total dimension that gives certainty to the entrepreneurs in our economy. And not only the entrepreneurs, by the way, the private sector itself is planning its steps according to natural gas. Industrial companies are reacting to whether there will be or will not be natural gas in the state of Israel. So if there's certainty, then more entrepreneurs tend to invest in fields and domains that you will need gas for. The moment that is doubted, then that it will have a much more widespread impact. I'd like to summarize with that. There is a new event taking place, a presentation of a new resource to a market, to our economy, from various points of view, a plethora of points of view. It can actually change reality. It's a reality changer, a real game changer. So when you do that in the eyes of the government, then it has to be done with the right kind of proportionality and wariness, caution. The great importance of determining such policy is the capability of that policy being sufficiently coherent and stable so that there will not be non-regret situations involved in it. In other words, that there shouldn't be a situation where you cannot take a step back and change things. There should be a dynamic of changes in accordance with the circumstances, and that's the best way to do it. And that is what we wanted to actually run our natural gas economy.